Welcome to the Full Nelson. Today I am going to be talking about the differences between semi-automatic, handguns, and revolvers, and the pros and cons of each. As you can see, I don't have any revolvers here on the table, and that's because I don't own a revolver, and I'll talk about that later on in the video. But for now, let's get into it and talk about the pros and cons of semi-automatics first. So the thing semi-automatics have going for them, well, the biggest thing that semi-automatics have going for them over revolvers is probably the capacity. On semi-automatic handguns, full-size handguns, it's pretty typical that in something like this 9mm Glock 17, you've got 17 rounds plus one in the chamber. There are some guns that hold as many as 19 with just the stock regular magazines that come with the gun. With the Glock, you can get up to 33 round magazines that will fit in a Glock 17. So semi-automatics really excel when it comes to capacity. They have a pretty big advantage over revolvers in the capacity department. The other areas where I feel like semi-automatics kind of excel over revolvers are, I feel that they're easier to shoot and get good at shooting in my experience. Now, other people may disagree with that, but I've never been able to shoot revolvers really well compared to semi-automatics. And people that I've handed a gun who have never shot a gun seem to be able to pick up pretty fast on shooting a semi-automatic and get pretty good and proficient at it as opposed to a revolver. We usually find that quite a bit more difficult to shoot and shoot well. So that's another advantage, in my opinion, that a semi-automatic has over a revolver. Some people may disagree with that, and that's fine. Another advantage is the platform that they come in. Semi-automatic handguns are generally like these Glocks or M&Ps or XDs, any of those guns, the Palmer frame guns, they're pretty light, especially when you consider the capacity and stuff like that. You've got a pretty lightweight firearm. When it comes to concealed carry firearms, the advantage they have over revolvers is they can be pretty slim. Revolvers, no matter how slim the rest of the gun is, they have the cylinder that usually bulges pretty wide. So that's an advantage that semi-automatics have over revolvers. And I would say the feel in hand for me, I prefer the way a semi-automatic feels in hand over a revolver. So those are kind of some of the pros that a semi-automatic has over a revolver. Now, what are semi-automatics really good at? Semi-automatics are really good for self-defense or target shooting or anything of that nature against people. So self-defense against a person, a 9mm is adequate. You can get a 40 Smith & Wesson, you can get a 45, a 10mm. There's a lot of calibers that are available. They're all perfectly suitable and more than adequate against a human target for self-defense. So that's where semi-automatic really excels, is in self-defense against a human or smaller critters, stuff like that. That's where I feel like semi-automatics are really good. Now, some of the disadvantages of semi-automatics are that they do not have the raw power that revolvers have. And we're going to talk about that. For any of you guys who don't know anything about ballistics or anything like that, I'm going to try to give you guys some comparisons to put things in perspective that will hopefully help you understand the difference between the raw power that a revolver can provide and what most semi-automatics are capable of. So, the disadvantage, raw power. That's about it. Another thing is some people say they're less reliable than revolvers. I've always found my semi-automatics to be extremely reliable, so I can't really tell you if that's a major advantage or disadvantage. Maybe some of you have more experience and you could speak to that, but I can't. So those are the only two. The one is definitely a disadvantage, which is the raw power, and then the reliability, that's somewhat debatable, at least from the reading I've done. So, the advantages that a revolver has, or the things that a revolver has going for it, some people claim they're more reliable, but the biggest thing is just the raw power of a revolver. And I'm going to try to put that in perspective for you guys right now. So, 500 Smith & Wesson is probably the biggest revolver that I know of right now. I'm sure there's some other Wildcat revolvers that are probably even bigger than that. But 500 Smith & Wesson is pretty widely accepted as the standard for the most powerful factory revolver that's available. And I've written down some loads here to give you guys an idea of just how powerful a 500 Smith & Wesson is compared to something like this 9mm Glock, a 40 Smith & Wesson, or a 45. And so here's some load data for you. I've only written down a 45 load and a 500 Smith & Wesson load, but I happen to know probably 9mm and 40 Smith & Wesson loads off the top of my head. But a 500 Smith & Wesson is capable of pushing a 700 grain bullet at 1,200 feet per second. The hottest 45 caliber load I could find will push a 230 grain bullet at 930 feet per second. So what that means is that a 500 Smith & Wesson is capable of pushing a bullet that weighs 3 times more than what the heaviest 45 caliber bullet weighs at a faster speed. In other words, a 500 Smith & Wesson, one shot from a 500 Smith & Wesson has more power as far as sheer energy and bullet mass than 3 shots from a 45. Okay, so to put that in perspective, 1 round out of a 500 Smith & Wesson revolver is more powerful than 3 shots from a 45. Now, it's about equivalent to 5 shots out of a 9mm. 1 shot of a 500 Smith & Wesson is about same velocity, bullet mass, weight, all those types of things. It's about equivalent to getting shot 5 times with a 9mm. And it's about equivalent to getting shot 4 times with a 40 Smith & Wesson. So, where does a revolver really excel? Well, where do you really need all of that raw power? When it comes to shooting a human target, as I mentioned, or you know, self-defense against a human, 9mm is more than adequate. This round will easily penetrate completely through a human with most hollow points and stuff like that. If you look at the penetration test, they would generally go through a person, or certainly get plenty of penetration to kill a person. So where do you need the raw power that is available with a 500 Smith & Wesson or with some of those big revolvers that are available? 44 mag, 460 Roland, 454 Casal, any of those types of big revolvers. Why do you need that raw power? Well, I know one of the most predominant situations in which people carry those revolvers are when they are guiding fishermen and stuff like that in Alaska, when they're hunting and you're guiding people on hunts and stuff in Alaska, or Russia, or any of those areas where there are really, really big predators. So if you had a really big animal such as a brown bear that weighs 1,200 to 1,500 pounds, it's no longer a matter of how many bullets you can carry. It's a matter of whether or not the bullets are even capable of penetrating deep enough to hit the vitals of the animal. And that's the situation in which those great big revolvers really shine, and there just isn't hardly any substitute for them as far as a handgun is concerned in that type of situation. So in that type of situation, you're not, you know, it's not an issue of I need 30 rounds, it's an issue of I need rounds that have so much power that they'll blow right through this bear's sternum, through all the fat, all the muscle, everything that those rounds need to penetrate through in order to hit the vital organs of that animal to stop it. So that's where revolvers really shine. Now, I did forget one statistic to give you guys one more idea of the perspective of what the 500 Smith & Wesson is capable of. I told you the 700 grain load, but one of the most common loads for a 500 Smith & Wesson is a 440 grain bullet. And a 440 grain round out of a 500 Smith & Wesson is going, let me see if I've got that written down. I thought I had it written down, but I don't. But I'm pretty sure I remember off the top of my head. Maximum load is around 1,650 feet per second for a 440 grain load. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with revolvers or handguns, but you've shot shotguns, if you've ever shot a slug out of a shotgun, most of the slugs you shoot are 1 ounce slugs. 1 ounce is 437 grains. Okay, 437 grains. So the 500 Smith & Wesson will shoot a 440 grain bullet at 1,650 feet per second, a little more than that, but it's approximately that range. A 12 gauge shotgun will shoot a 37 grain slug at approximately 1,850 feet per second. So you're talking a revolver that is shooting a round that is only going 200 feet per second slower than a 12 gauge. So it's almost equivalent to having 6 rounds of a 12 gauge shotgun in your hand. I mean, that's some serious firepower. Anyway, so I'm just trying to give you guys some perspective of just what revolvers are capable of, and why when you hear guys debate about revolvers versus semi-automatics, you can debate, some of the things, reliability and stuff like that, but when it comes to raw power, there is no debate to be had. Revolvers just absolutely blow away semi-automatic handguns. Now, there are some semi-automatics like Desert Eagles and some unusual semi-automatics that way, 10 millimeter, which Glock makes, and you can get 1911 and stuff in those, which are, a 10 millimeter is about 357 Magnum. Maybe a little better than a 357 Magnum, because you typically can't shoot 220 grain bullets out of a 357 Magnum. But it's on par with the weight of bullets that are about the same weight. It will push them at about the same speed out of a 10 millimeter of what you get out of a 357 Magnum. So when you get up bigger than that, 44 Magnum, 500 Smith & Wesson, bunch of these other calibers I've described, a revolver really has a lot to offer compared to semi-automatic. Now, the reason why I don't own any revolvers is because I really don't have a need for that level of firepower where I'm situated. I don't really have any of those big giant critters or anything like that I need to worry about or anything like that. So my semi-automatics do just fine for me, and I find the advantages they have over revolvers are the reason why I choose to use those particular firearms. But that's not to say that revolvers don't have advantages. They can have some major advantages like I tried to describe in this video. Now, one thing I wouldn't recommend doing, and some of you may disagree with this, but I personally would never go out and buy a revolver in a 9 millimeter, or buy a revolver that's chambered for like a 45 or a 40 Smith & Wesson or one of these little teeny calibers that I can already get a semi-automatic in. Because to me, it's kind of like you're taking some of the worst elements from the semi-automatic, which is it lacks the raw power that revolvers have available to them, and then you're going to combine that with some of the negative sides of a revolver, which are the lack of capacity, slower reload, a lot of those types of things. So it's kind of like you're mixing the worst things about each type of firearm together, and you end up with a firearm that has not necessarily the best rounds as far as raw power is concerned, and they also lack the capacity, the speed of reload, they may be more difficult to shoot, stuff like that. So I wouldn't do that. It just doesn't make a lot of sense to me to buy revolvers than really small calibers. Now, some of you who may be big revolver fans and you want your kids to shoot them and stuff like that, in that situation I can understand having those smaller calibers. But as far as actually using them and getting the most out of what each platform has available, I would go big with revolvers, and with your semi-automatics, you can go with any of the calibers that are available, and they have the advantages that I've outlined. So that's my take on revolvers versus semi-automatics. One has raw power, one has capacity, is really kind of what it comes down to. And depending on your situation, you may want the capacity and you may want the raw power. If you guys have any questions or comments, you can leave them in the comment section. That's all I've got for you guys today. Thanks for watching. See ya.